Based on criminal psychology research, what drives serial killers and serial rapists to commit their crimes? While both biological and psychological factors play a role, psychological factors tend to be more dominant in shaping their behavior. It's particularly interesting to note that female serial killers often use more subtle or gentle methods compared to their male counterparts. Today, we'll explore these criminal characteristics from a psychological perspective. Serial killers who usually document their killings are especially sexually sadistic. These killers derive pleasure from having absolute control over their victims, and documenting their acts through writing, photos, or videos allows them to relive that sense of dominance repeatedly. Some sadists even keep trophies from their victims like hair, bones, or other body parts, which they revisit to reinforce their feeling of power. Take Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, for example. He would send detailed accounts of his crimes to the media, essentially showcasing his work. This behavior was fundamentally about extending his psychological control over society. Many serial killers spend years immersed in violent fantasies before acting. Documentation helps them turn these fantasies into reality, allowing them to rehearse and refine their methods. After their first kill, some realize their fantasy wasn't fully achieved, so they use their records to adjust their approach, trying to reach their idea of perfection. For sexual sadists, documenting their crimes makes their victims' suffering permanent, serving as a substitute for sexual gratification. Sexual murderers might preserve body parts to fuel ongoing sexual fantasies. Some serial killers display perfectionist tendencies, similar to artists or overachievers. They feel compelled to carry out their killings in specific patterns and document every detail. Otherwise, they experience psychological discomfort. Take Luis Garavito, for instance. His ritualistic approach to crimes, including targeting victims of specific ages, shows this obsessive refinement of his criminal work. Frontal lobe damage has been identified as a key characteristic of serial killers based on extensive neuroscience research into violent behavior mechanisms. The frontal lobe serves as the brain's decision-making center, managing higher cognitive functions, including impulse control, emotional regulation, moral judgment, and social behavior norms. Large-scale MRI studies have confirmed that 85% of violent offenders show abnormalities in their prefrontal cortex, such as reduced gray matter density and decreased blood flow. For instance, brain scans of serial killer Charles Manson revealed significantly lower frontal lobe function compared to the average person. Childhood abuse or brain trauma can lead to underdeveloped frontal lobes. Research indicates that 66% of individuals with frontal lobe dysfunction commit violent crimes as adults, with the risk dramatically increasing when combined with serotonin level abnormalities, which affect emotional stability. Prefrontal cortex damage also explains other typical behaviors of serial killers: lack of post-crime remorse. Due to their inability to assess consequences, their violent acts often appear mechanized. Ritualistic crime signatures. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex dysfunction leads to repetitive patterns, like specific corpse arrangements or trophy collecting. Poor social adaptation. People with prefrontal damage often display social isolation, which aligns with the lone wolf criminal profile commonly seen in serial killers. Female serial killers are typically more efficient than their male counterparts as they don't torture their victims or keep trophies. More than half of female killers commit murders for financial gain, such as money, property, or inheritance from family members. These black widows are quite common among female killers. Unlike male killers who often act on twisted psychological needs like sexual gratification or control, these women have clear objectives: getting what they want. Society's stereotypes about women being gentle, kind, and harmless actually help female killers conceal their crimes. Research shows it takes about 9 to 12 years to discover a female killer's crimes compared to just 2 years for male killers. This invisibility makes them more efficient and lethal. Interestingly, female killers usually target people they know, minus family members, partners, or children, while male killers prefer strangers. This not only makes it easier for them to reach their targets, but also makes their crimes harder to detect. After all, who would suspect a mother or nurse of harming their children or patients? Take Jane Toppin, a nurse nicknamed Jolly Jane for her friendly appearance. Between 1880 and 1901, she used her profession to kill at least 31 people by injecting them with morphine and atropine. She would watch her victims die, finding pleasure in the process. She claimed her crimes were linked to emotional struggles, suggesting she might not have become a killer if she had married. Her methods were direct and efficient, without torture or trophy keeping. Most murderers will repeat their crimes in the short term. This reduction in cooling off periods often happens because the criminal acts fulfill some intense psychological needs, almost like a psychological addiction. Take Harvey Gacy Harper, for example. After his first murder while working at the hospital, he experienced an overwhelming sense of achievement and control. This feeling became so addictive that he killed at least 15 patients in just 1 year. Each successful crime acted like a shot of adrenaline, reinforcing his dependency on these acts. Over time, he needed to commit crimes more frequently to satisfy this psychological craving. The shortening cooling-off periods are also related to how their crime patterns escalate. In criminal psychology, there's something called a spree killer concept, where killers evolve from targeted to random attacks. Initially, they might have specific targets and plans, but as they repeat their crimes, they gradually lose control and become more random and frequent in their actions. Studies have shown that many serial killers display an almost compulsive state before their capture. They feel compelled to keep committing crimes to relieve their inner anxiety and emptiness. Without this release, they become increasingly agitated and restless. Serial rapists usually have specific recurring fantasies that drive their behavior. Sexual assault fantasies often serve as the original template for rape incidents. Many sex offenders begin satisfying their sexual urges through fantasies during adolescence, and these fantasies typically involve elements of violence or coercion. Research shows that 3/4 of rapists used rape fantasies for sexual gratification during their teenage years, and over 80% of them masturbated to pornographic materials, which further reinforced their dependence on violent sexual fantasies. These fantasies aren't just idle daydreams, they're psychological outlets. Unable to find satisfaction through normal channels in reality, often due to poor social skills, emotional trauma, or sexual inadequacy, they turn to fantasies to fill their inner void. These fantasies gradually become an integral part of their psychology, even developing into a psychological necessity. Take Jean-Luc Blanche, known as the backpacker rapist who operated across various regions in France. He would kidnap victims, take them to remote locations, and repeatedly rape them. Strangely, he would act friendly afterward, even offering to drive victims home. This behavior suggests he created a completely controlled scenario in his fantasies, satisfying his desire for control and domination. Dominant personalities typically pair with submissive counterparts. Dominant types thrive on control and authority, while submissives find security in following rules and pleasing others. Their needs mesh perfectly. Dominants fulfill their self-worth through leadership, submissives gain belonging by being guided. Case 1. Charles Manson's Family, 1969. As a textbook dominant leader, Manson brainwashed young followers like Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel. Submissive traits included emotional dependence. Krenwinkel called him, "my God," deriving purpose from obedience. Ideological mimicry. They weaponized Bible quotes to justify killings as racial war. Structured roles. Women seduced for funds, men carried out murders in a strict hierarchy. Case 2. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, 1963-65. Brady controlled Hindley through abuse and propaganda. Belief manipulation, forcing her to read Mein Kampf to frame child murders as social cleansing. Role fixation. As a nursery worker, Hindley lured victims while Brady tortured, killed. Fear-based loyalty. When she tried to leave, he blackmailed her with recorded evidence. Sexual sadists typically target strangers for their crimes. This is because there are no pre-existing emotional bonds or social connections between strangers. This emotional blank slate makes it easier for the abuser to dehumanize their victims, treating them as emotionless tools or objects rather than human beings. This objectification is central to acts of sadistic violence, as it's only when victims are stripped of their humanity that abusers can inflict violence without restraint. When victims are seen as individuals with emotions and identities, abusers might experience guilt or moral conflict. To reduce this psychological pressure, they engage in dehumanization, viewing their victims as inanimate objects rather than living beings. We can observe this pattern in many extreme behaviors. For instance, soldiers in warfare often dehumanize their enemies to cope with the psychological burden of killing. Similarly, sadistic abusers disconnect emotionally from their victims to make it easier to carry out violent acts. This behavior not only harms the victims but also destroys the humanity within the abusers themselves. Post-traumatic stress can lead to either forgetting everything or remembering everything in vivid detail. Why do some people remember everything? When someone goes through extreme trauma like war, sexual assault, or a severe car accident, their brain's limbic system gets intensely activated. This system, which handles emotions and survival threats, makes memories incredibly vivid, like they're permanently etched into every corner of the brain. These memories aren't linear, they're fragmented and can pop up as flashbacks, nightmares, or even physical reactions. Take Vietnam veterans, for example. Just hearing a helicopter can instantly transport them back to the battlefield, making it feel like they're reliving the experience all over again. This intense remembering isn't because the brain is working better. It's actually a sign that it's kind of malfunctioning. The constant high levels of adrenaline prevent the brain from processing memories normally, and emotional tension gets stuck in the neural networks, making it impossible to process or forget. On the flip side, why do some people forget everything? This isn't just normal forgetting mixem, it's a psychological defense mechanism called dissociation. When trauma is too overwhelming, the brain actively separates certain memories from consciousness, like locking away a videotape in a drawer. This type of memory loss is especially common in childhood trauma or long-term abuse cases. For instance, some adults who experience childhood sexual abuse might have no memory of it at all, or just vague fragments. But forgetting everything doesn't mean these memories are gone forever. These buried memories can resurface when triggered by certain smells, sounds, or even emotional states. They might suddenly break into consciousness in fragments, causing confusion and distress. Dissociation is basically the brain's way of protecting itself under extreme stress, but it also means losing control over these memories. The 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. This theory was introduced by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her groundbreaking book on death and dying. While it was initially developed for terminally ill patients and their families, it's now widely used to understand emotional responses to various losses, whether it's losing a loved one, going through a divorce, losing a job, or dealing with a serious illness. During the denial stage, people refuse to accept reality. This temporary shield actually helps maintain psychological balance and prevents emotional breakdown. When denial can't hold up anymore, people start facing the harsh reality. All those bottled up emotions need somewhere to go, and that's when anger takes over. This anger might be directed at the people who caused the loss, institutions, society, or even themselves. After the anger subsides, people try to negotiate with fate, God, or others to ease their pain. They start making deals, thinking if only statements, hoping to change their situation or find some comfort. When these bargaining attempts fail to change anything, depression sets in. People feel completely helpless, lose interest in life, and struggle to find motivation. This deep sadness is a natural response to their difficult situation. Finally, people gradually come to accept their new reality. This doesn't mean they're suddenly happy or completely over their loss. Instead, they learn to adapt to their new circumstances and start finding meaning and hope again. It's just how our minds learn to cope and move forward. Most cross-dressers are heterosexual, and this behavior is frequently observed among sex offenders. Cross-dressing typically develops when someone's sexual psychology is disrupted during childhood, leading to generalized sexual attraction or the substitution of symbolic objects for opposite-sex partners. During puberty, they learn to achieve sexual satisfaction through specific items or body parts, which becomes reinforced through conditioning. In November 2008, a disturbing incident occurred in a residential area of Ottawa, Canada. A 15-year-old girl named Leah was sexually assaulted in her home. Police investigation revealed that the perpetrator was a cross-dresser who would wear women's clothing during his attacks to achieve sexual arousal and gratification. After his arrest, he admitted to having a long-standing cross-dressing compulsion that was directly linked to his sexual offenses. Between 1986 and 1991, a series of rape and murder cases targeting women occurred in Jiqua County. The perpetrator, Lee Chun-jae, was a cross-dresser who would wear women's clothing during his attacks. He sexually assaulted women to satisfy both his sexual and psychological needs. In his confession, he described experiencing intense sexual excitement during his crimes, which was closely connected to his cross-dressing behavior. Everything in a home reflects the inner personality of its owner. There's a deep connection between our living space and who we are as people. The items we keep, how we arrange them, and how tidy we keep our space. These all act like a mirror, showing our state of mind, what we value, and our daily habits. According to Ising's theory of crime, people with criminal tendencies score high in psychoticism. These folks tend to be impulsive, lack empathy, and chase thrills. In their homes, you might find things scattered everywhere without any order. They often collect items with an aggressive edge, like weapon replicas or sharp decorative pieces. It's their way of showing their risky, impulsive side. These individuals also score high in neuroticism, meaning they're often emotionally unstable, anxious, and prone to depression. Their living spaces might be packed with decorations or collections, sometimes using dark colors and awkward layouts that reflect their inner turmoil. People who lean towards violent behavior often keep things like weapons or workout equipment in their homes. stuff that shows their aggressive, confrontational nature. On the other hand, those prone to property crimes tend to surround themselves with expensive items and luxury goods, showing their obsession with material possessions and need to own things. When criminals choose their targets, they primarily look for situations with low risk and high reward. Elderly single women perfectly fit this criteria. Due to their physical limitations and slower reaction time, they're less likely to resist, making it easier for perpetrators to maintain control. Statistics reveal a disturbing trend. Single women account for 90% of home invasion victims, with those over 60 making up more than 80% of the cases. Many violent criminals are driven by a severe psychological imbalance and a desperate need for power. They try to compensate for their own feelings of powerlessness in society by controlling and harming vulnerable groups. Elderly single women, being both physically weaker and socially isolated, become their perfect targets for emotional release. This psychological pattern isn't just an isolated phenomenon, it's quite common. Research has shown that violent offenders typically have poor impulse control and are emotionally driven. When selecting targets, they focus more on their chances of success rather than the possibility of getting caught.